This podcast is brought to you thanks to the generous support of Whistler Blackcomb, leaders in delivering adventure.
Now, I'm a professional athlete, so I'm flying my paraglider, in Baffin Island with polar bears everywhere. How can I lower the consequences if my motor goes out and I land with the polar bears? I'm going to carry like a lot of bear flares, and I'm going to carry a shotgun, not so much to shoot the bears. Then I can lower the consequences, and that's what I do when I'm guiding. Can I just throw this piece in here and throw the rope through it in case I screw up? What can I do to lower those consequences?
This is Delivering Adventure. Welcome to the podcast that explores what it really takes to share adventure like a pro, with your friends, your family, and as a profession. My name is Chris Capio, and I'm coming to you from Whistler, British Columbia.
And I'm Jordy Shepard, recording from Canmore, Alberta. After a lifetime of working extensively in different parts of the adventure guiding industry, Chris and I have teamed up to launch this podcast. In each episode, you will hear top adventure guides, managers, marketers, and athletes share their best stories, advice, and trade secrets. The goal of this podcast is to share how you can take yourself and others farther from the mountains to the office and beyond.
In this episode, we continue our conversation with Will Gadd. Will is an ACMG Alpine guide sponsored athlete with Red Bull. He has ice climbed Niagara Falls, Helmken Falls, the last glacier on Mount Kilimanjaro, as well as icebergs and many other places. Most of those places, he had first ascents. In this episode, we continue to hear what Will has to say when it comes to avoiding misadventure. This is the second part of our two-part series with Will. Now, Jordy, can you give us some context to some of Will's accomplishments?
Well, Chris, in the last episode, part one with Will, we did talk about quite a few of his accomplishments, and really what some of the more amazing side of things, or incredibly amazing side, in addition to his accomplishments, are his ability to think about this stuff. And so you'll hear Will, and you'll see on his social media feeds that he actually will throw out there when he's actually made a mistake. He has that kind of humility piece, even though he's quite an amazing athlete and guide. And yeah, that's not an easy thing for a lot of people to do, is to say when they did something wrong or had a close call or a near miss. So that's a big one. And then on the other side of it, he's a risk manager, and he's more than willing to talk to anybody and all of us about risk management. He operates often kind of on the edge of risk, at a very high level, and he's done a lot of thinking about it. So it's some really good take home messages there about risk management.
Okay, those are some great points about Will. So, let's hear straight from him. Let's bring him back into the DA studio. So, Will, you just finished highlighting how important it is for us to be able to reflect on our mistakes if we want to become better at managing risk. I've been doing a lot of work in the resort skiing industry in Whistler, specifically within the snow school, and training instructors on risk management and decision making. One of the areas that I've been working on is culture. For many years, it's been kind of accepted that instructors get hurt at work. This has resulted in a normalization of risk-taking behaviors at work that aren't that healthy for the instructors, their clients, or the organization. What myself and some of my colleagues have been working to change is the idea that it's not normal to go to work and come home with a broken leg, knee injury, or a concussion. My dentist certainly doesn't worry about that at work. Of course, instruction and guiding mountain sports is not like most jobs. Still, snow sports instructors, or what I also refer to as front country ski and snowboard guides, have a super high accident rate that really needs to come down. The good news is that it is, and I'm really fortunate to be working for a very progressive organization that has a lot of great people doing really good things. However, it's still tough. For guides and instructors, our job isn't to avoid risk, it is to expose people to it. Risk lies at the core of what an adventure is. So, Will, what do you think we can do to balance between that fine line of taking enough risk to push ourselves without going too far across the line and becoming reckless? Do you think that there is a way for us to spot this before it happens?
Yeah, that's a good question. It happens both professionally and personally, and so it's well, I'm curious about what you've done inside the snow school at Whistler to encourage that. I bet you've got a good answer to that for your teams, because it's super important. I mean, what have you done to do that? And then I'm just curious because one thing I've learned is that a lot of industrial applications, and I'd put potentially the snow school into that, they're better at managing this than a lot of us who are doing recreational risk taking of one kind or another are. So I'll bet you've got a good. I want to ask you that question. Can I ask you that, or is that allowed, or do I have to?
Well,
answer?
yeah, of course. You can definitely ask questions.
Thanks, man. So what'd you do? How'd you fix it?
Right? It's making sure people have the tools to be able to make the right decisions. And I think that you sort of answered this earlier, and it starts with defining what success is. Success isn't getting to the top or pushing it to the max. Success is getting back down to the bottom in better shape than when you started. And if that means taking a little less risk or taking a little more time to prepare or those sorts of things, then that's what you have to do. But I know one of the things that I try to implement here in the snow school is to create sort of a simple message that an instructor would use before they decide to take on an elevated risk. And that was to ask yourself two questions. Do you need to do it? And if you don't need to do it, then don't do it. And if you do need to do it, then what can you do to give yourself the biggest chance of success? And, going back to that first one, I was driving back from Lake Louise last fall, and we're near Revelstoke, and this guy's driving down Highway 1, and as you know, a super big mountain highway, we're coming along, double yellow line, guy behind us decides to pass us, and 20 minutes later, he's one car ahead of you in a solid line of traffic. And you're thinking, like, did you need to take that risk? Like, and if you needed to get ahead of us, then why didn't you just wait for a little longer till you got to a passing lane and do all those sorts of things? And so I guess, yeah, from my perspective, that's kind of one way that we can try to remind ourselves. What do you do, before you're taking these risks to try to prevent yourself from crossing that line?
Well, I like that tactic, and what you just said is really important. It's like, do you need to do this? And for me, it's kind of a balance thing. Like, I've got no problem with somebody doing something really dangerous if they really do understand the consequences and that's what they want to do. Like, if somebody wants to huck 100-foot, gap on their bike and they're stoked and they've picked up after 2 or 3 people that have failed to make a 100-foot gap, so they really understand what that looks like when it goes bad and they want to fire it up, then right on. The problem is when people don't have a realistic appreciation of the negative outcomes and they just want to do something. They're like, this would be rad to do X, but they don't understand what the sort of potential outcomes are of that. So the risk is unbalanced and they don't know what it looks like when you're in hospital for a month because you broke, both your arms or whatever, and they haven't picked up after that. And so I try to give a realistic appreciation of what the consequences are, even on a smaller level, to my guests and then to myself. It's like, as you said, is this necessary and is it balanced? I want to run this waterfall in my kayak. I'm kayaking a lot this year because I got elbow tendonitis because I mountain bike too much. Anyhow, so and I'm out paddling and I'm like, do I want to do this? And what's the outcome? Am I okay with that? If I run this waterfall and it goes bad, it's a pool. They'll pick me up. We're all good. But if it's like, wow, if I'm off my line by like 30 centimeters, I'm going to get taken out by that rock on either side and I'm going to break my elbows minimum. And do I still feel good about it? Yeah, the approach is solid. I'm willing to take that risk because it's so cool. But if it's not, then maybe I back it down, and I think having a realistic appreciation of the poor outcomes and an honesty about your own skill levels is really, really important. and an attitude of some degree of like the knowledge that you can get it wrong. That's really, really important. And the higher the consequence gets, are you still comfortable with that or not? And also an appreciation for how great it is to be able to do this stuff. The only broken bone I've had in the last 30 years was mountain biking last fall. And I was on a machine-made path, and I ripped over this hill as you do on a machine-made path, and this little thunderstorm had ripped out part of the trail. And all of a sudden I'm in like, suitcase-sized blocks with no trail. And I broke my ankle. And, was I going too fast? Maybe. Was I having a hell of a lot of fun? Yeah. Was that a realistic outcome? Yeah. I don't blame the rocks of the thunderstorm. It's like, shit happened. And that's a realistic outcome. And I was okay with that consequence. I might feel better or worse if the really worst outcome had happened. And we all have to draw this line somewhere. That, I could have been hurt a lot worse is how I kind of look at it. So I try to operate with enough margin and to understand when I don't know enough to even define the margin. If I'm flying sailplanes, I'm learning how to fly sailplanes. I don't even know enough to know what's reasonable or not. It all seems reasonable. I'm on a sailplane that goes 100 kilometers an hour at glide. That's like 3 times as fast as my paraglider. This is wicked. I can do anything. My instructor's like, no, that's a bad idea. So, understanding the consequences and being humble enough to admit that you don't really know what they are is super important. I don't want to riff on this too long, but Alex Honnold had an awesome quote. I did this inner thing with him a couple days ago, and he goes, yeah, everybody thinks they're making great decisions right up until they have an accident or die. And I think that's really useful to remember that. We all think we're making great decisions. We all think we know our limits, and those other people are crazy. Right? I would never do that. I'd never make that error. We're making great decisions. But I've responded to a lot of accidents in the mountains now, and I've never had anybody go, we knew we were going to get destroyed, but we went for it well, maybe once. But most people are like, we didn't see that coming, and it went bad,
Yeah, we mostly get positive feedback.
Yeah.
We feel it's positive feedback, right? The day is ended. It's all good. Nothing bad happened, or it was like little bits of misadventure, right? But nothing that was, huge injury or fatalities or anything, right? That's the bulk of what we do. And then, but the reality is it's actually, most of the time it's neutral feedback that we're getting. It's not positive nor negative. And then we do get the negative feedback at times, right? Which is the backhand of God slapping us down and telling us we crossed the line. And so, but there's this misconception that, that day was the best day ever. And that was positive feedback, but it traps us.
Yeah. Yeah. Those false positive feedback loops and stuff. And there's a whole academic and intellectual side to all of this. And I'm really into that. Like how, I read a lot about that. I've thought a lot about it. And then you're out there and you're making decisions, and we're trying to remember that this could be a false positive feedback loop, or it could be the Swiss cheese model, or it could be X, Y, Z, whatever. But we're trying to make decisions out there. And it's tricky to remember that and to not be your last good decision, but your next bad decision, and I guess I'm focusing personally a lot more on the quality of what I hope is the quality of my decision making. Did I actually look at many of the variables? Did I understand the environment? And no matter what the outcome is, then my kind of academic exercise is, did I make good decisions today or not? And if I did, great. Or sometimes I'm like, wow, I don't even know if that was a good decision. The outcome was good, but it was actually a pretty shitty decision. I made it really fast and wow, it worked out. We went down that face with 2 guests and nobody got hit by a rock. I'm great. No, that was a really shitty decision. I didn't even know where I was going. What the fuck was I thinking? And I do that personally and professionally, less to that level professionally than I did. But I think that willingness to examine your decisions is really, really important. That's what makes for better decisions in the future. And when you have a successful day, did you make good decisions or not? And I often go through my log. I have a really detailed log on what I did. It's not super detailed, but it's like, what did I do? And then I look back through that log and I'm like, that was 5 years ago. I really thought I was kind of killing it. And yeah, maybe I would think about that differently today. And it's useful.
You've experienced adventure in a lot of sports. like all these different activities that you do. Do you feel there's some activities that have more risk and more chance of going poorly, and why?
Yeah. So for starters, anytime we go into the mountains, probably even driving, we're taking a greater than daily life risk most of the time. That to me, people are like, oh, the driving isn't very dangerous. It's the mountain. Or people often say, the most dangerous part of our day is the driving, and this is bullshit. It's not. I've lost 30 some friends in the mountains now, and one of them died driving. That's it. The rest of them got killed in the mountains. So when we go into the mountains, we are taking a larger than daily life risk, and this is why insurance companies have tables. And they're like, wow, you go climbing 20 days a year at altitude, we're not going to insure you. Because the last 10 people we did that, 3 of them died. They're not idiots. They're just looking at the numbers and trying to parse it in some way that makes sense. So when we go into the mountains, we're taking a larger than daily life risk. And I think one thing we've done a relatively poor job of sometimes as professionals is admitting that, because we don't want to admit that. We're like, we're really good at this. We're going to keep you safe. No, we're just going to make it somewhat less dangerous than if you were doing this on your own, but it's still a really hazardous place. So I start with that. And then for me, in whether I'm riding motorcycles or flying my paraglider or quitting base jumping because I thought it was too dangerous, it's that consequence complexity line. Where are you on that line? If you're sport climbing in the gym, it's, broken leg terrain most of the time. Even if your partner drops you, not married, nobody dies doing that. If you're skiing the bunny hill, you get a broken leg, but I don't think, you're generally going to be okay there. And now you're bumping it up, and you're skiing in an area with low knowledge of the snowpack, and you've decided to ski something really steep, and you're with a bunch of buddies that charge hard. Now you're in high complexity, high consequence, low knowledge terrain, and you kind of just want to choose consciously where you want to be on that complexity, consequence, probability spectrum. And ice climbing is about the same as riding a motorcycle to me. And statistically, when I do the research on that, and you can find all kinds of things on that, it's about the same. Base jumping, pretty much everybody dies who stays at it long enough, and that's true for the mountains. You spend enough time there, you're going to die there. But hopefully you pick the point you're comfortable with and get a good long time there before that happens. So base jumping, I quit. I was like, I'm not going to last very long at this. This is not how I'm not very detail oriented. And you want to be really detail oriented and really, really methodical. And that is not, unfortunately, me. And so I quit. Just felt like I was going to get killed really quickly. So I was out. And I gave up riding motorcycles in the street 25 years ago for the same reason. I didn't need that amount of risk plus the other sports that I do in my life. And I think if we talked about this more and like, what's your level of risk, dude? It's like, well, I ride a motorcycle to work as fast as I can 5 days a week, and I base jump on the weekends, and I enjoy, orgies with like, like, okay, dude, we're not going to do this together. Or, let me send you to my other friend. I'm going to send you to Jordy. He's going to manage this better than me as a guide, or whatever in life, and getting those people, that's a big part of it is your group. Where are their risk tolerances? Do they like to ride motorcycles really fast every day? Then right on, you're in the right group, baby, if that's what you want to do. But for me, that's not where I am. And I don't know, long answer to a short question, but does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally does. And along with that, do you have any specific advice? I think you've already given some, but any specific advice for other guides and instructors in terms of managing risk? Any bullet points to throw out there?
Well, I think we've talked about a lot of them. But I do think for me, as just professionally speaking, and it's relatively intellectual, I am much more interested in consequences. I think I'm relatively good at evaluating consequences, and I'm less good at evaluating probability. I used to think I was pretty good at evaluating probability, and I'm not horrible at it, but I'm most comfortable operating with lower consequences and doing everything I can to lower the consequences. That's been something that's been professionally helpful. And I'm a professional athlete, so I'm flying my paraglider, in Baffin Island with polar bears everywhere. How can I lower the consequences if my motor goes out and I land with the polar bears? I'm going to carry like a lot of bear flares, and I'm going to carry a shotgun, not so much to shoot the bears. Like, then I can lower the consequences. And that's what I do when I'm guiding. Can I just throw this piece in here and throw the rope through it in case I screw up? What can I do to lower those consequences with the understanding that it has to be effective? I see a lot of risk mitigation that does nothing but slow people down. Don't put the rope on unless it's attached to something. In one way or another, we push those limits as guides sometimes. But I think that's probably the biggest change for me personally that might be useful for other professionals, is just trying to limit consequences and realize that we're flawed in our probability perspective. Does that make sense to you guys? Or
I had a heli ski client who he was used to skiing in Canadian terrain under Canadian guides, where I'd say we're fairly risk averse. We do ski steep stuff, and we ski in glaciated terrain and rocky terrain and all that kind of stuff. But it seems like to me in Alaska, it's just big terrain, and you don't actually have a lot of control over your guests when they're not actually attached to you, right? In the heli ski environment. And so this guest told me he went heli skiing in Alaska, and he said it was kind of a scary experience, but he said he felt pretty good about them putting a harness on him. And he skied with a harness, and because he'd never skied with a harness on before. And I said, "Oh yeah, was there a rope attached to you?" And he said, "No." I said, "Well, that just makes it easier to recover your carcass down in the birch run at the bottom of the run." Because it's not actually preventing you from falling or the bad thing happening.
I think that's a really good...
but he had this, his perspective was that, well, this made me safer.
Interesting, yeah.
I'm like, well, no, just more recoverable.
Yeah, it makes the people coming after you safer. But it doesn't, that's a really interesting, things like that. So, we often get focused on mitigation, but does it do anything? And then what do we want to do? And examples like that's a great example. You should do a podcast on this, eh?
Yeah, we should probably put it off.
No, I think these are all really, I love this stuff. And the intellectual side of it's really good. But I think we all understand this stuff intellectually. And I've read a lot of really intellectual risk management engagement pieces. And I think a big part of it, though, is that when you're out there in the field, it's not intellectual. It needs to be, it's mostly about your own brain, and are you actually making good decisions here, and what are your priorities, and the exterior stuff. Like, people tend to focus on like systems. They're like, oh, I know how to use my beacon really well, and that is important. Do not screw that up. You got to practice those systems, but it's your ability to avoid using your beacon ultimately that helps save your life. That keeps you in there game after day after day. I think the other thing I would say, I think a lot of people say recreational. I kind of try to use the word personal because some of them are pretty serious about it. But the one thing I would say to kind of personal climbers, paddlers, paraglider pilots, whatever, it is to get professional level training. For many, many years I did these sports, and I'd taken some avalanche courses and even some of the early versions of the professional young ones when I was younger. But I'm much, much better in the mountains because of the guide training I took when I was older. That you're always in a professional environment when you're in the mountains. You don't get to play like LeBron James in basketball when unless you're like on a really, really good team. But when you go into the mountains, you're up against like LeBron James and everybody else. You are in a professional stadium when you walk in there. So I think it's pretty important to get high-level professional training. I don't think everybody needs to be a guide, but I think it'd be pretty cool if everybody could go through that process, because that's what you're doing, is you're learning how to understand the environment and manage your own brain and try to get the outcomes that you want. I'd love to go through ski instructor training because it's professional level training and I'd be a better skier. But people will like do some of that. They'll take an AST1, but you're in a pro environment. An AST1 is useful, but what are the professionals thinking, and how are they operating, and what can we learn from that? And I guess that's what this podcast is about. So we're on the same page again. But it's cool. Like, what can you get on those courses, and can you do them? And if I never guided another day in my life, I'd still think the guide training I had was some of the most valuable time I've ever had in the mountains. And I know how to use my beacon a hell of a lot better thanks to you, Jordy. So I appreciate that.
Oh yeah,
That's
my
good.
pleasure. So one thing that I think we miss in the guiding world, we miss the mark on, is that we do call ourselves guides more than we call ourselves instructors. And I I encourage anyone who wants to get better at being in the mountains and safer and better with risk management and decision making, hire a guide, but don't hire a guide to just have them drag you around the mountains and tell you where to stand and tell you to go faster at certain times, that sort of thing, right? And when to eat lunch. It's which is never, you're always just crazy as you go. But it's more for what do you want to get out of this day or this week or this series of years that you spend with me as a client, so that you can be better out doing these. I agree that the personal days, maybe recreational has a negative connotation to it, like it's sort of haphazard, but these personal days that you want to go do, I'll help prepare you for it so that you don't have to pay me anymore, and it's a progression that we can go through. I'm a big fan of that, and so we are guides and we are also instructors.
Yeah, I love that idea. I'd take it even one step further and say that a lot of times what we're trained to do as guides in some ways is to either tell people what to do or teach them skills. But I think as I've my guiding career in some ways started with that Boys and Girls Club 40 years ago. What I'm really trying to do with that now is to educate. And I think that's very much what you mean by instruction. And some of my guests, they want to know about,
in today's day and age,
you're walking along into the ice climb, I'm like, so what do you see right now? And we'll talk about it. And be like, I spend a lot of time with my people. It's like, well, the things that I see right now is it's really windy up high and you can see the snow transport. Have you clued into that yet? And maybe they have, maybe they haven't. But that's the most important thing I've given them all day. Now they're going to be looking around. I can teach them how to kick their crampons better, swing an ice tool, whatever. But the thing that's going to really, really help is that awareness of the environment and that education about how these mountains work. This book I'm working on, and I'm going to interview you about it for sure, Jordy, is basically how to understand the mountains. And that's the deep education that often will help people survive, I think. And so I'm chewing through that. It's like, how do we understand how these things that we go into work, from the snow perspective and also from the sun, and this stuff all goes together. And so that's my current kind of book project I'm chewing on, and it's not going super well because it's really hard, but it's fascinating. And that education and instruction piece is super, super critical. I'm with you.
We can learn a lot from YouTube. You can actually learn how to launch your own podcast actually. But the one thing that that I've learned over time is there's no substitute for proper sort of formal outdoor education, and something that comes in a structured environment where you're dealing and learning with what the professional level and standard is. And we see a lot of people out there that don't have the opportunity or don't see the value in doing that. Now, you have an advantage, Will, in that you live with a pro athlete, and what is that like for you?
Well, I assume you're talking about Sara Hueniken, my wonderful partner here, and she's awesome, but she's also a really good educator, and works on the various guide programs and runs women's camps and does a lot of instruction, teaching, education, and all of those things are super important. But she's great. She has and her risk tolerances honestly are lower than mine, and she's usually right. So we spend a lot of time in the mountains together, and we jokingly call her the voice of reason. I'm like the ADD squirrel. I'm like, ice climb, let's go play with it. And she's like, well, what about it? And I think that's one of the reasons I really like traveling in the mountains with her, is that she sees things that I don't, and generally has a lower risk tolerance than I do. And that's why we've gotten up a lot of stuff safely. If there are two of me out there all the time, that's not the strongest way to roll. And we can get some things done, but with Sara, I can do them often with a higher margin than I would otherwise. Plus she's fun to go out with. She's having a good time out there too, and we do some fun things together for sure. And but no, I'm fairly certain that I'm alive, at least partly due to her voice of reason. on more than one. And I hear it even when she's not around. I hear her voice. I'm like, so, and it's often the good voice of pulling me back. So yeah, she's awesome. And we're both pro athletes. We're sponsored athletes, and we have different obligations as well for that. But it doesn't change the fact that I want to get back in the bar.
And both guides and both guides and instructors too. Yeah, it's an interesting match.
And given all of that, we managed to almost like really hurt ourselves sport climbing. So everybody has these moments where like, could we have done that better? And one of the things I love about her is that we talk about it and it's like, wow, we didn't really nail that, and here's why, and what were you thinking? And she's like, oh, we were trying to get more roots in, and I wanted to go quickly, and I was like, yeah, I did too, because we only had 2 hours before the sun went down, so we're hammering, and then we talk about it.
One of the most dangerous things in the mountains is to have a group of guides together, because they are sometimes unguidable.
That's a really interesting, I think I've been part of that phenomenon a couple times.
Like ski touring, for example, you go out with a group of guides and there's, 5 guides and there's 5 up tracks put in.
Yeah.
Because everybody thinks that they have the way, they know the way. And it's like, why don't you maybe take a back seat here for a second here and we can just break one trail.
Well, I think that's one of the really big pitfalls that you've just identified with being a guide is we do have to have a high level of confidence in our judgments, right? We do, or we're paralyzed into inaction. We have to make the decision that we can go and do whatever it is, at least at the start of the day, and modify as need be. But we're going to go out there and we're going to do something that has significant hazard, and we have to believe in our judgments. Yet at the same time, we have to keep those judgments malleable, and not believe our own hype. It's like, was it the Ice Cube song, "Don't Believe the Hype"? Like it really applies to us as well, but we still have to be confident enough to do this and not be like, well, I don't know, like, it's a fine line between, and fear is one tool I use. One of my favorite quotes is I think it was Richard Feynman who said this. He's a famous physicist, and he said the first principle is that how did this go exactly? It's a great quote. I'll probably just totally murder it, but the first principle is don't fool yourself, and the second is that you're the easiest to fool. And he was talking about physics research, but it applies to everything. Like, I fooled myself many times into thinking that cloud wasn't an issue. So having some degree of both confidence and then enough humility to recognize that things are not going well. And I think that'd be the fine line too. It relates to what you said earlier between if you're clued in to this adventure is not going well, you can change it, but you have to be willing to go, it's not going well, and change it and fix it. And that takes some degree of either humility or in my case, having been hit between the eyes so many times with a baseball bat that I listen. It's like, so now I try to be really clued in. It's like, well, it's 11 o'clock and we're supposed to be here by 12, and that gully comes into the sun at, 12:15, and I'm standing in the middle of it. What am I doing? And rather than continuing to push up it, but it does take some degree of humility and willingness to change fast.
Will, we're approaching the end here. What are some pieces of equipment that you can recommend to our listeners?
Well, I think the first one is your brain, and how you know yourself, like self-knowledge. So that's a piece of equipment. That is the most important piece of equipment. You can do anything with anything if your brain will figure out how to do it, right? Like Conrad Kane guided all these mountains with like a chunk of hemp rope and a cigar. And we're out there with all this stuff, and we're often not getting up the routes he guided, a long time ago. So it's not I think that one of the key realizations is not the equipment that determines the outcome. It's you and how you use what you have. So people are often very equipment focused, or belay focused. They want to I know how to tie a belay 15 different ways with a cordelette. Well, that's great. But if you're going to load the belay like that, you kind of screwed up. So it doesn't matter. The systems and stuff are important, but it's your brain and how you approach it that matters way more than that. So, but you asked a really legitimate question and I went sideways. So to get back, I think having good comms, if you're in the backcountry, you need to have good comms in case things go sideways. And whatever equipment that you have to know how to use it. It matters less whether exactly what rope or exactly what beacon, but you better know how to use that equipment and know its limitations and be dialed on it. And I fall down on that sometimes, for sure, but I do work pretty hard to actually understand my gear and have what I hope is a professional level of knowledge about it. And the standard is different. When I'm guiding, it's like I spend the night before. It's like, here's my bag, and is my inReach charged? Is my radio working? Here's my route plan. If I send it to my guests so that they have it too, because when my phone dies, they have it, and I do that all the time. Have I done all these steps? And personal, it's often a little bit, again, because if at the end of the day, if I'm guiding and there is an incident, I can look at it and say, did I make good decisions or not? The outcome maybe wasn't what I thought it would be, but did I spend the time and do my diligence? And I missed something, and that's the way the ball bounces. It's a lot easier to look at yourself in the mirror when you've made the proper preparations and your equipment and you have the right equipment and you've done the right diligence. Then it's a lot easier to live with yourself when it goes sideways, in my experience. So I think that's important. Whatever equipment you have, know how to use it. At least have comms, whether you're pro or not. Yeah.
That was a perfect answer. You raised an excellent point, that accountability piece, right? At the end of the day, we are going to be the ones going over and over and over those decisions if things go sideways, especially if it led to you ending up on the couch or in the hospital or whatnot. And we're going to be the ones, thinking, oh, why did I do that? Right. And, hopefully instead it's like, oh, I'm so glad I did that. I'm so glad I did, this and this and this and this, because that helped to make sure that situation wasn't so much worse, or it allowed me to not be in that situation at all.
Yeah, I think that's just to riff on that for 1 second, because I think it's really important. If you do enough things right, then you have a higher tolerance when things go wrong. So maybe you got caught in a class 1 because you did something wrong, but you didn't get caught by the class 4 in the train trap because you did enough things right. And so I think that's what you just said, super important.
Well, Will, we're going to let you go here. That was amazing. Thanks so much for this. If you want to find out more about Will, you can visit his website at willgadd.com. That's Will, WILLGADD.com. That is where you can get his contact information, find links to his latest projects, exploits, filmography, and see some of his coaching tips. And you can also find out how you can hire him to be your guide or guest speaker. Okay, Jordy, when it comes to avoiding a misadventure, what were your takeaways from this episode?
Well, one of them was looking at gaining experience by learning from mistakes. And I think I've said this before, but some of the best mistakes to learn from are other people's rather than your own. And so if you made a mistake and you get the chance to learn from it, do. If you see somebody else making a mistake and you get a chance to learn from it, definitely take advantage of that. Experience is really only good if you can learn from it. Reflecting on a decision-making process is also important, and Will's spoken to us about that. Focusing on the quality of the decision-making process, using information that you have available to you, and we have a lot of information available to us nowadays to help with decision-making, instead of just focusing on the outcomes and being just goal-oriented. So a good decision and a good outcome are not necessarily the same thing. It's really important to make good decisions, and that will lead to good outcomes.
Yeah, that is such a good point that he made, that, a good decision and a good outcome are not always the same thing. And we often, think of things in terms of, well, that worked out, so it must have been a good idea. And in fact, looking at how we arrived at that decision, and realizing that, our decision-making process and the information that we used was flawed, and learning from that in the future is super powerful, as you pointed out. So that's a really good one, Jordy. The things that kind of stood out to me when I listened to that, and there were a lot again, is that idea of managing risk by lowering the consequences. And, so often we think of managing risk or reducing risk as just not doing something, but what if we just did it in a way that allowed for a buffer in case things were to go wrong? And an example I can give you is, you know, what if you're skiing through an alpine bowl that's got low visibility and there's avalanche debris in that bowl? What if you were to go slower instead of faster? And so if you hit a piece of debris and you're going slower, obviously the consequences are going to be much, much lower. Now, it's easy to turn around and say, well, why would you do that? Why would you ski through that alpine bowl when there's low visibility and there's avalanche debris? Well, sometimes we find ourselves in situations where we have to do that. That's just something that's there. And so Will's point is the idea of lowering our risk by lowering the consequences, taking away the worst case scenario. And so he mentioned, putting in ice screws so that if you do fall, you don't fall as far. And so if we can take those steps, we can reduce the chances of something going really wrong if it were to happen. The other thing he pointed out that I really liked was that idea of identifying risk tolerances beforehand and to continue to evaluate. And through the course of a day, our risk tolerance can change. We can feel better about taking on more risk. As we gain confidence, we can also feel like we should be taking on less risk as we get more tired, or or we realize that maybe we're over our heads. I'll share a quick story with you, Jordy. I was running a hiking multi-sport tour in the Canadian Rockies for many years, and as part of the trip, our guests would go and spend an afternoon rafting on the Kicking Horse River. And there was one trip in particular, the start of a season, where our guests went out and the company had 4 rafts out on the river, and 3 of the 4 actually flipped multiple times. One of our guests ended up in the water for over 2 kilometers. We had to take her to Banff to get checked out for secondary drowning, which luckily she didn't have any signs of that, and so it turned out well. But afterwards, we really had to reevaluate our risk. Our boss, Peter, who we'll actually be interviewing in another episode to come, called up the company and asked, hey, like what happened here? And their response was, you know what, maybe this is too much risk for you. And in fact, it was. Actually, Peter reevaluated our relationship with that company and took our business to another company, which had a much different philosophy when it came to risk taking and management. And so that's something that I think we all have to do, as Will outlined, is figure out what we're willing to do and what we're not. Will noted that he'd given up base jumping and high performance, motorcycling and things like that. And so that's an important thing for all of us to consider. Now, let's turn it over to you, the listener. What were your takeaways? You can share your thoughts, stories, or insights with us via our social media feeds or by emailing us. You can find our contact information at deliveringadventure.com. We've also posted our contact information in the show notes, as well as links to Will Gadd's website. Well, that's almost it for this episode. Please don't forget to follow or subscribe to this podcast through your favorite streaming service. And if you can, please share this with your like-minded friends. We need your help to grow this podcast's audience so that Jordy and I can keep this going. Besides, the best adventures are the ones we've shared with others. Before we finish, though, we're going to hear one last story from Will. Thanks for listening.
Oh man, I don't know. So many funnies so many stories are funny in retrospect. It's like that type 1, 2, and 3 fun, and you get into the type 2 fun where it's only fun and good when you're back at home and remembering it. I think the trip that I screwed up worse than any other was a few years ago. I went in to climb in the Cirque of the Unclimbables in the Northwest Territories, and I'm fired up. I've got a film crew. It's like one of my first gigs, and I'm like just so stoked. And we go in there and it snows for 2 weeks, and we're in the Cirque. We climb very close to nothing, And in my genius, I decided the thing to do was to paddle out from the Cirque de Unclimbables down a creek that nobody had ever run to the Nahanni and then out to civilization. It was going to be awesome. Best idea ever. Unfortunately, our food bag got flown out from our cache by accident. They took the haul bag with the food and left us the haul bag with the gear. So we show up to start paddling out after 2 weeks in the snow, and we have like 14 Snickers and a large thing of coffee for the next 3 days. And so we're going down there, and we decided to fish, which is awesome. So we're catching fish. Things are pretty good in the creek, except we didn't have any bear spray because we didn't. And that night the grizzly came and took all of our fish. So we're like trying to like wave our kayak paddles at this grizzly to get him off, and he's stealing our fish, which we really want. And then it starts raining, and we, in our genuine wisdom, we'd taken this giant tarp, which my friend of mine is like, it weighs nothing, it's the bomb, this tarp will be great, forget sleeping bag, forget. So we're lying there, and it starts leaking, and there's seam lines every like 16 inches, and our shoulders are like 20 inches or whatever, so it's raining on us. And I'm like, dude, where'd you get this tarp? And he's like, well, it's actually a light diffuser from an Antonio Banderas film I was working on. It wasn't even a tarp. I'm like, so now we're out of food. Our grizzly bears stole our fish, and we get down to the river, and it's raining in like 4 degrees. So we're totally hypothermic, and we have no calories. And so we paddle until we were like, I'm probably gonna get arrested for this, but we paddle until we were so cold we couldn't think. And all we had actually was a lot of white gas. So we'd pour white gas on a log jam, throw the lighter at it, and then it would go up, and then we'd strip naked and get warm. And this was the only way we could actually get warm, at which point one of these commercial Nahanni canoe trips would show up, hey? And so we'd run naked toward the canoe trip, say, hey, do you have any spare food? We're starving. And they'd like throw stuff at us just to get us from coming any closer. And, day 6 of this, we did finally reach civilization. But yeah, that was where I learned to plan a little bit better about what we were doing and maybe mark the bag that gets flown out a little more clearly. And the whole trip was like that. And yeah, we survived, but that was a serious misadventure. Don't do that.